So even though Baptists are the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, the particular stripe that we're focusing on in this conversation, this kind of non-dispensational Baptists who love the doctrines of grace, right? They're a distinct minority, okay? But even within this relatively small group of non-dispensational Calvinistic Baptists, there are several theological subgroups within that.
Sometimes I feel the weight of the world fall down on me so heavy, and I need a friendly voice with some good theology. Calvinistically speaking, so I mix a manly drink, Pepsi and shoe polish, and I hit the YouTube link. Don't say hit, that sounds violent. And I feel my troubles all melt away. It's your Calvinist podcast with Keith Foskey. Beards and bow ties, laughs till sunrise. It's your Calvinist podcast with Keith Foskey. He's not like most Calvinists, he's nice.
And welcome back to Your Calvinist podcast. My name is Keith Foskey, and I am Your Calvinist. Now, I want to start right away by saying today's episode is a part 2. I recently had Richard Lucas and Brent Parker on to talk about their book, 4 Views on the Covenantal and Dispensational Theologies. And today I'm welcoming them back. Actually, it's the same day, but don't tell anyone. We're just doing 2 recordings in the same day. But this second recording is going to dive deeper into the subject of Baptist covenant theology. All 3 of us are Baptists. Both Richard and Brent are graduates of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. They've been students of Dr. Stephen Wellum and have been connected to the teachers there at Southern. And so we're going to talk to them about what are the distinctions between what's called progressive covenantalism, which if you didn't see the first episode, I definitely recommend you go back and watch that to give you a little bit of a heads up on what we're talking about today. But we're going to talk about the distinctions between things like progressive covenantalism and what might be referred to as 1689 federalism. Baptist Covenantalism is our topic for today. And so I want to welcome again to the show, Richard Lucas and Brent Parker. Thank you guys both for being with us.
Great to be here again.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And I am correct, right? You guys both are graduates of Southern Theological Seminary, right? Southern Baptist?
Yeah, we both did our MDivs and PhDs there. Brent did his PhD under Steve Wellum, and I did mine under Tom Schreiner. And to complete the Baptist Trinity of professors there, both had Peter Gentry as well. Old Testament and systematics.
Well, I need to step back and apologize. I did not refer to either one of you as Dr. Lucas or Dr. Parker. So as the joke goes, I'm glad I'm not sick. No, it was the wrong kind of doctors. Wrong kind of.
Right. My mom just calls me Richard, so that's what I go with.
Yeah.
Nice. Hey guys, I just want to remind you that this podcast is a ministry of Sovereign Grace Family Church. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can go to our website at sgfcjax.org. Also, I want to remind you about our important podcast partners, including our longest running partner, Tiny Bibles. If you go to tinybibles.com, you'll find the smallest printed Bible on the market. It's available in the King James, New King James, and the New American Standard Version. And if you use my name, Keith, in the coupon code, you'll get a discount. Also, I want to remind you about Squirrely Joe's Coffee, some of the best coffee in the world, and it's shipped directly to your home. And if you go to squirrelyjoes.com/yourcalvinist, you'll get a free bag. Also, if you use my name, Keith, in the coupon code, you'll get 20% off your next order. Striving for Eternity Ministries offers Bible conferences for churches of just about any size. They do an array of topics, including apologetics, evangelism, creation, the family, and much more. So if you're interested in having them come and do a conference for your church, reach out to Striving for Eternity Ministries, and you'll find their information in the description below. This episode is also brought to you by Dominion Wealth Strategists. Be sure to watch for the commercial during this episode to see how they can serve you. Well, gentlemen, when we talk about covenant theology, in particular Baptist covenant theology, there has been a revival in this topic, particularly in the last maybe 20 years or so, with like the Founders movement and other groups like that have really had a big push for something called 1689 Federalism. We see this in the workings of the I call them the Greater and Lesser Renahan. This is Jim Renahan and his son. I know his name, but what's his son's name?
Yeah.
Sam. Yeah. So we have James Renahan, who has written extensively on the 1689 London Baptist Confession. Samuel Renahan, obviously having written a ton on that as well. And they've done videos and they've had conversations on the subject of Baptist covenant theology. Have you guys personally interacted with those men on this subject, or do you guys just sort of run in the same circles but don't know each other?
I have a little bit, yeah. In fact, let's see, 2 ETSs ago, we had a dedicated session on Baptist Covenant Theology. I presented a paper comparing progressive covenantalism and 1689 federalism that's going to be published in the upcoming journal of the Southern Baptist Journal of Theology that Brent is assistant editor for. But what is interesting is James Ranham was in the audience, and he was the first one to come up and talk to me about the paper. And we talked actually the night before that as well. And actually, he was at our church here in the fall for a missionary conference, and we talked for a little while here as well. And I've had a little email correspondence with Sam Ranham as well. I've had probably more extensive interactions with Brandon Adams and also Daniel Scheider. Daniel Scheider is a professor at IRBS, the seminary that Jim Ranham's the president of. And he's a PhD grad from Southern as well, actually studied under Steve Wellum, but he's a 1689 Federalist guy who's published on this a little bit too.
Great. And I've got good relationships with like Tom Askell from the Founders Ministry, and I know they are big proponents of Renahan and his teachings and those things. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and sort of what the landscape looks like, as well as what the differences and distinctions are. And I'm glad you wrote that paper. I look forward to reading it. I think it's going to be great. Brent, what's your background with the 1689 Federalists and stuff? Do you connect and talk to these guys a lot?
Not a whole lot. Richard has, with his focus on the covenant of creation, or some refer to it as covenant of works. I mean, I attended that ETS session as well, and so I've had a little bit of interaction with Daniel, but not a whole lot of the Renahans. The church I go to locally here in the Columbus, Indiana area, it's actually up Edinburgh, just 15 minutes away. Tom Askell actually visited our church. I don't know, when was that? 8 months ago or so. So I actually got to meet Tom Askell in person. So that was really that was beneficial. But I haven't had a great deal of interaction because my focus has been more on covenant theology, dispensational theology. And I think that a lot of the work I've done trying to show Jesus is the true Israel, I think most, if not all, 1689 Federalists would be in agreement with my labors on that score.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I do want us to talk in this episode about where the agreements are and where the disagreements are. I had Tom Askell on my show several months ago, and I mentioned to him that I leaned more toward progressive covenantalism, and he said he actually made a very positive statement about it. He said that he had a lot of positive interactions with guys from the progressive covenantal side, and that they had even had a progressive covenantalist come and teach at the IOPT, which was their teaching center down there at the Founders. And our subject, of course, which often does, revolved around distinctions on the Sabbath. And he said, well, what this guy believed about the Lord's Day is good enough for me, kind of thing. It was, people can go back and watch the episode and hear what he said, but it was basically like, it was a very positive statement about progressive covenantalism and the guy who was representing that, who was teaching. So I thought that was really good, because I do hope that we can find, even though we're going to find areas where we disagree, I hope we can find areas where we're united as well, because the Reformed Baptist community, the Calvinistic Baptist community, is already a small subset of Christianity as well, and further subdividing ourselves, further drawing the circles so tight that only ourselves are standing in them, and we're standing on one foot, I think often is self-defeating. So if we can find areas of agreement, that's great, and still be willing to discuss the areas where we disagree. So I'm going to go back to you, Richard, for just a moment and ask if you could, in a simple way, maybe outline what you see as the major distinctions between your position, progressive covenantalism, and 1689 federalism.
Okay, maybe if you don't mind, Keith, I'll step back and use an analogy that I think might help frame some of this conversation. I think I'll pivot right off what you just said there. So just give me a second to develop this, and you can poke at it, okay? So most Baptists, as you just said, at least in the United States, I think it's fair to say, are much more dispensational when it comes to issues like eschatology, ecclesiology, right? And really something less than Calvinistic when it comes to soteriology, okay? So even though Baptists are the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, the particular stripe that we're focusing on in this conversation, this kind of non-dispensational Baptists who love the doctrines of grace, right? They're a distinct minority, okay? But even within this relatively small group of non-dispensational Calvinistic Baptists, there are several theological subgroups within that, right? You identified two of them, but I want to frame it a little wider to kind of that'll help explain the comparison. I think right now it's fair to talk about four different subgroups that fit on that, right? So progressive covenantalism, 1689 federalism, New Covenant Theology, and what is come to be called 20th century Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology. I can explain that more in a second. All four of these different theological groups fit under.
Can I interrupt you for just a second? Would that be represented by someone like Sam Waldron? Is that last one?
That would be fair. Yep, fair.
Okay.
Yep. Earl Blackburn, Fred Malone. Some of these guys have represented some movement. I think there's been some movement with Sam Waldron, but yes, like Al Martin.
I only bring that up because I interviewed Sam Waldron last year, and I asked him. I said, where do you see and he made some of the distinctions. So people who have listened to the show maybe heard that episode and heard us talking about the very thing you're talking about. So yes, thank you for laying out the playing field. I appreciate that.
And really, I would say until 2013, and I'll talk about why that's an important year. Until 2013. Every Reformed Baptist would have, for the most part, from the 1950s till then, described their covenant theology in the same kind of way. Okay, so I'm referring to that movement of people, right, who self-describe themselves as Reformed Baptists, the 20th century Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology. And so, but all four of these different groups that I just laid out, they all fit underneath this banner of Calvinistic Covenantal Credo Baptists, right? So let me paint a word picture of how I'm seeing the theological landscape. So imagine with me, right? We'll have fun here, right? Imagine with me a forest of trees. And in my analogy, this forest is a Baptist forest. That is, all the trees in this particular forest are Baptists. Now, there's other forests, of course, right? Representing other denominations. There's Lutheran forests and Presbyterian forests, Anglican forests. But here we're just focusing and talking about the Baptist forest. And all the trees in this Baptist forest, at least in the modern United States version of this Baptist forest, are dispensational and non-Calvinistic, right? But there's one tree in this forest that's different. This one tree is a Credo Baptist tree in a Credo Baptist forest, but it's a Calvinistic covenantal tree. This particular tree has two different major branches. One branch calls itself Reformed Baptist, and it loves the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, and it says it advocates for covenant theology, including Sabbatarianism. The other branch advocates for New Covenant Theology. And if you're looking for some confessional connections, they probably prefer the First London Baptist Confession instead of the 1689 Second London. And it's hard to know exactly what to call this other branch, but for simplicity, we can just call them Sovereign Grace Baptists or New Covenant Baptists, maybe, right? Is all this tracking so far?
Yeah, our church holds the First London, so that's funny that you mentioned that, because we would probably be on that branch. Okay,
there you go. Okay, all right. So again, right, a Baptist farce, all dispensational, non-Calvinistic, except for one Calvinistic covenantal tree. Now, and maybe the MacArthur types or Calvinistic dispensationals, they can have their own tree too, but we're not talking about them right now. Okay, all right. And this tree has two main branches: one that's Reformed Baptist producing covenant theology, and another producing New Covenant theology. Right. These two branches are in the same larger tree, but they're growing away from the shared trunk. However, in the last 10 to 20 years, two new limbs have sprouted out of these two branches, one limb on each branch, and they are growing towards each other. Progressive covenantalism is the limb growing out of New Covenant theology branch, and it's growing back towards the middle of the tree. And at the same time, 1689 Federalism is the other limb growing out of Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology that's growing towards the middle of the tree. So 1689 Federalism and Progressive Covenantalism are growing toward each other, but they're coming from opposite directions. So in my conception of the theological landscape, there are four varieties of non-dispensational Calvinistic covenantal credo Baptists. And if we want to chart them very broadly from more continuity to more discontinuity, then on the continuity side, first comes that cumbersomely named 20th Century Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology. And then moving towards discontinuity would be 1689 Federalism. They recognize more discontinuity than their predecessors of the previous generation. Next would be Progressive Covenantalism. And finally, on this very narrow spectrum, New Covenant Theology represents the most discontinuity. So I think what I'm trying to describe is not just, I think, accurately an historical development, but I think also what I think the purpose of this conversation is partly an opportunity for some theological rapprochement between these groups, that they have so much in common in light of the larger theological spectrum of beliefs, especially even among Baptists, and yet they find themselves in conflict, so much theological conflict, even ecclesiological conflict. But I think if you actually really understand what's actually being argued by these two newer limbs, you can see that there's actually more to find in agreement when you understand them more fully, and you kind of get past the superficial terminological differences.
That was actually super helpful and super encouraging, because I like the idea of growing toward each other rather than growing away from each other. I mean, that just is an encouraging thought, because that goes along with what I just said about, trying to find unity, even though we may have some differences. Where is our unity? And where I tend to see the biggest difference within my conversations, this doesn't mean this is on a scholastic level or even on a larger level, just within my own anecdotal experience, the biggest differences I see tend to fall within the category of how we understand the continuity of the Mosaic law, particularly the Ten Commandments, and whether or not we should see the law as being divided up into three parts, a tripartite division of the law, or whether or not we see the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, being one whole covenant, which has been given over to the New Covenant, as it were, fulfilled in the New Covenant. So those are some of the areas I see. And as I said, I've done debates on the Sabbath. And when I did my first debate on the Sabbath was in 2018. I did it against the Presbyterian, and all the Reformed Baptists came all the guys in the area who were Reformed Baptists came and sat on the Presbyterian side. Like they were all sort of like I was a man without a country because I took the anti or non-Sabbatarian position. Brent, when it comes to that subject, do you think I'm hitting on something that's correct? Do you think that's one of the major divides, is how we see the law?
Yes, and the Sabbath, and of course Richard can't elaborate, but so much of when you think of 1689 Federalism, even how now the New Covenant is considered the covenant of grace, instead of having a covenant of grace where all the post-fall covenants are administrations, That right there is that what Richard's talking about, growing together. That is a big move to growing together, because of course in progressive covenantalism, the new covenant represents the culminating covenants. All of the previous redemptive historical covenants find their culmination in Christ. And so that right there is already a move together. But yeah, when I think about the, and of course both camps affirm the covenant of redemption. I think of all of the similarities, but then, the only differences that, at least that come to my mind, is how we understand the Mosaic Law covenant and moral, civil, ceremonial, and then of course where it really plays out is the 1689 Confession of Faith and the statement that's there on the Sabbath. And of course, even within Reformed, you think of the Heidelberg Catechism or the Second Helvetic Confession. The Helvetic Confession of Faith is out of the Swiss Reformation. And then, of course, there's the Westminster Confession of Faith. 1689 would be very similar to, on the Sabbath, to the Westminster Confession of Faith, but the Heidelberg and then the Helvetic Confession of Faith, it definitely seems to go in a different direction, not as firmly Sabbatarian. And so, just even in the Protestant Reformation and thinking of confessions of faith, there's differences on the Sabbath. But I would say, but between these covenantal Baptist expressions, I mean, Richard can maybe point to some other, maybe some nuances in considering the creation covenant, maybe where we may have some agreements, but also some disagreements. But largely, in my thinking, it's exactly what you said, Keith. I think of moral, ceremonial, civil in terms of the breakdown of the law. And then, of course, where that really comes out is on the Sabbath. Sabbath's considered part of the moral. It's part of the Ten Commandments, so it's part of moral law. And so that comes straight over, so that the Lord's Day is the Christian Sabbath, according to Reformed Baptists. And progressive covenantalism would differ on that. And then I would pass it on now to Richard for maybe other nuances between the views.
Yeah, and Brent, you might want to, I don't know if you want to comment here about this, but you are taking the lead and putting together, from an editorial point of view, a journal article dedicated to the issue of the Sabbath, the Southern Baptist Journal of Theology. It's probably going to be a little ways out before that is released, but I think that'll be a welcome issue.
Do that, yep.
But no, I mean, for certain, the issue of the Sabbath, I think, is where kind of the rubber meets the road. I think there's some ways to see some rapprochement even on that issue. But, I'm happy to talk about whatever you think your listeners find me most helpful, Keith. But I think starting with that issue kind of obscures the amount of agreement, because it focuses on like maybe a singular point of disagreement. But I think when we understand the covenantal foundations of that are distinctly Baptist in both the views, in distinction from, say, Baptist Covenant Theology, I think we'll see actually there's opportunity there for seeing more agreement, even around something like the Mosaic Law and even the Sabbath.
Yeah, and that's so I have a lot of questions and a lot of things that I would love to dive into. I know we're limited on time, but when it comes to, let's step away from the Sabbath issue, because like you said, that's the one thing that sort of tends to be almost like a stick. In
practice, it's not going to look a lot different for most people in practice.
And that's a point I made with my local community. I said, we basically do the same thing on the Lord's Day. It's just whether or not how we see it as a law and whether or not we see it as a moral commandment, things like a thing like that.
Yeah. So maybe can I just say just real fast, like we're not like, I don't hear you saying, Keith, and we're not saying we're not we're not non-Sabbatarians because we just want to like skip church and go to football games on Sunday.
Yeah.
You know, like for me, this is not a practical or ethical difference. It's a hermeneutical difference. So
Yeah.
for me, that's the issue, is just a hermeneutics. But I don't think in practice, what I do, how we practice the Lord's Day as a family and as a church is going to probably look very similar, if not exactly similar, to most Sabbatarians.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very, very good point that I think often is missed. I remember someone saying to me in a conversation, well, you know, people who aren't Sabbatarian, they just don't want to do what God's commanded them to do. And I'm like, you know, what are we not doing other than, you know, maybe a non-Sabbatarian may eat at a restaurant on Sunday. That'd be probably one of the bigger, you know, sticking points, is whether or not you're allowed to go out to eat. And again, not that that's our topic for right now, but that's often, it comes down to those. I was in a conference with Sam Waldron, and he's such a sweet guy. So nice. He's been so nice to me, but I was in a conference with him on the Sabbath, and he talked a lot about that. The practical applications of it were what came out in his conversation. And I think that's a lot of that is what makes up the division and the debate. What can we do? What can't we do? And then,
well, I think so. In our modern evangelical culture, so many people take church so loosely, right? They like, oh, just stay home this week, or oh, we're going to Disney this weekend here in Florida or whatever. And so they have a cavalier kind of practice towards regular church attendance and serving and worship. And so maybe some people feel like they need a stronger biblical foundation to fight against that lackadaisical approach to church. So they're like, well, look, it's one of the 10 commandments. You're breaking one of the 10 commandments. And like, so I appreciate that impulse to want to push back on people having kind of that approach towards church. But I don't think hermeneutically that's the best way to read the fourth commandment in terms of its applicability to new covenant believers in light of Christ. But in terms of what I do on the Lord's Day with my family in our church and worship, we're dedicating the day to worshiping Jesus.
Yeah.
I would hope that in the broadest sense, we would all agree that we obey the fourth commandment ultimately by resting in Jesus Christ. That's
my argument. That's certainly the argument I've made.
By having faith and trust in Him, we find our rest in Him. You know, so I would hope. Now again, yeah, there might be some practical. Some practical differences, but like Richard is saying, I think it's more on the hermeneutical side.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So let's talk about some of the other areas where there would be distinctions. You mentioned about the 20th century position, the 20th century Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology. That's a mouthful, but the 20th century Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology. Do they see I know they hold to the three covenants: covenant of redemption, covenant of works, covenant of grace, but do they see the covenant of grace as the same as a classic covenantalist would, that the covenant of grace begins after the fall and all of the other covenants are readministrations of that covenant of grace? Is that how someone like Waldron, and I don't want to use him by name, but someone in his position, would that be their position?
Yeah. So when there was kind of a revival of interest among Baptists for the doctrines of grace in the second half of the 20th century, especially in the Mid-Atlantic area, Walt Chantry, Al Martin, Ernie Riesinger, those guys who were kind of fathers of this, right? Ernie Riesinger was like a mentor to Tom Ascol in the Founders Movement. You mentioned them, right? So for that group, as they were kind of coming out of dispensationalism or reacting to dispensationalism, they were embracing the doctrines of grace. And they were saying, well, this dispensationalism doesn't seem to fit. And all these kind of old Puritan guys and reformer guys we're reading, they didn't hold to dispensationalism. They held to something called covenant theology. And so they're learning their covenant theology primarily from Presbyterian, from Paedo Baptist. A lot of their guys went to Westminster Seminary, studied under John Murray. John Murray's version of covenant theology actually was somewhat idiosyncratic in a couple different ways, and that is reflected in some of these guys. And they don't even recognize how idiosyncratic some of their versions of covenant theology are because John Murray, we can get into that if you want to, but his version. But in essence, they look at, say, Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 7, when it talks about the covenant of grace. And they want to, instead of seeing all the discontinuity of different dispensations throughout the Bible, they see that the redemptive history is united around the one plan of God, so one people of God, known as the covenant of grace. And the way the Westminster Confession of Faith describes it is it's one in substance, but varied in administration. There's different administrations of this one covenant of grace. And now, Sam Waldron wrote an early commentary on the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And especially, it's gone through multiple editions, but in the newer editions, he's starting to interact with 1689 Federalism and some. But I'm just going back to the earlier editions. Basically, they saw that Second London, which the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith is basically a Baptist revision of the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Congregational Savoy Declaration. So it takes that as a template, and then it makes some editorial changes, mostly around issues of ecclesiology, mostly. Well, there is a wording change in chapter 7 on the covenant. And some these early Reformed Baptists would just say the difference in wording is incidental. It's not representing a different covenantal theology. And so they kind of just brushed off the difference of wording and kept articulating it the same way. But they would just want to put a greater emphasis on the newness of the new covenant. And they would say that, the Baptist regulative principle would demand an updating of the administration of the covenant of grace during the new covenant to only be applied to professing believers and therefore credo baptism. So but essentially it was the same covenantal theology. And so they just called it covenant theology because they didn't think there was different versions of covenant theology. They would just emphasize a stronger administrative change in the new covenant. And because they learned it from Presbyterians. And what I think is interesting, just as an historical note, is I'm not trying to be mean to them, but I think it's fair to say that they were just ignorant of the fact that there was a distinct Baptist covenantal theology from the 17th century British particular Baptists that needed to be retrieved. So they didn't retrieve that because no one knew at least it was lost for history's sake, for the most part, for some 200 plus years, that there was a distinct Baptist covenantal theology. And so it wasn't until the turn of the century, and we can talk about why that is, that some in this movement started recognizing, hey, wait a second, some of these guys that were Baptists actually were formulating their covenant theology a little differently. And we need to retrieve that because it's actually more consistent as a covenantal undergirding of our credo baptism.
And that's where Jim Renahan is really pushing, right? I mean, when I say pushing, he has talked about how much research that he has done and read into the original authors of the 1689 and guys who were, framers and writers and the men who were actually contributing. And that's what he's saying. He's saying they had their own covenant theology that wasn't just a rehashing of Westminster.
Yeah, that's right. So, man, he's done great work on this, and a lot of this wasn't widely available. It started being available. So, basically, most of these works, first of all, they're out of print. Maybe unless you went to like an old used bookstore in London, you wouldn't find this stuff, right? Scholars began to have access to it around the turn of the century with something called EEBO, Early English Books Online, which was a digitization of everything in the English language in print. But you had to have subscription, you find it. But now, anyone can find it. But unless you were looking at an old microfilm, you wouldn't have read this stuff. So, I don't know, Brent, if I had Tom Nettles as a church history professor, and then Michael Haken. So Tom Nettles was a mentor for Tom Askell as well, and he's involved in this movement, and Michael Haken as well. So these were my Baptist history and church history professors at Southern Seminary, and Jim Renahan studied under Tom Nettles at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. That was his PhD supervisor, I'm pretty sure, and also for Tom Askell, and so the first kind of. So they started reading this, like, hey, something's a little different here, but they're starting to pull it together. And then the first kind of plank was in 2005. James Renahan was part of a couple guys who edited a reprint of Nehemiah Cox's work. Nehemiah Cox was one of the two, maybe the lead editor of the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And he wrote a work called the Discourse of the Covenants Between God and Man Before the Giving of the Law, something like that. In 1681, actually before the Confession of Faith was agreed upon by the Baptist General Assembly in 1689. But, the confession comes from 1677. Actually, that's the irony of calling it 1689. And so they republished that in 2005, and then also appended to it the John Owen's commentary from chapter 8, his third volume of his Hebrews commentary, where he discusses the difference between the Old and New Covenant. And the reason they do that is because Nehemiah Cox himself said that he was going to write on the Mosaic Covenant, a second volume, basically, but he didn't bother once Owen's work came out in 1680 because he said the same thing he was going to say. So they just republished that. So Cox references his readers to it, so they just republished it as one volume. That's actually just been republished as the 20th anniversary edition by Broken Wharf. And so, but that book is probably the fullest 17th century Baptist explication of covenant theology. Most of their works from the 17th century were polemical works, so they didn't detail out a full orb covenant theology. They just kind of assumed, and they were just mostly focusing on the polemics around baptism. But so that work, but it didn't really. I don't think most people realized. I'm pretty sure most people didn't realize that what that work was arguing for was a distinct understanding of Baptist covenantal theology. And so it wasn't until 2013 when Pascal Denot's book, The Distinctness of Baptist Covenant Theology, came out. He's a French-Canadian pastor, Reformed Baptist, who wrote a THM thesis in French. It got translated into English, and that got published. And really what brought that to prominence was Brandon Adams created a website, and he coined the term in 2013. It came out in June of 2013, 1689federalism.com. And it promoted that website. It had Jim and Sam and I think Rich Barsalis on there doing some videos. And that's where the term kind of stuck. And that's where they got to explain some of the differences. And so some of the things that are distinct about this version of Baptist covenantal theology that they're trying to retrieve. So 1689 federalism is really, to be fair, a retrieval movement. I understand there's some modern expositions of it, but they're trying to retrieve the version of Baptist covenantal theology that was held to not exclusively and not by everyone, but by the majority of the 17th century British particular Baptists. There was some exceptions, right? Sam Ranahan in his published dissertation outline lists at least three guys like John Spilsbury and Thomas Hardcastle and Robert Purnell were some exceptions that he delineated. So there was some exceptions that held to something more like what we call 20th century Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology that had a different understanding of the covenant of grace. But the vast majority of that first and second generation of British particular Baptists articulated a version of covenantal theology that had a couple distinctives. And those distinctives actually aren't represented explicitly in the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, but they were held to by the majority of the Baptists that first confessed that as a confessional document, and probably by the editors who produced it. And the changes in the wording between chapter 7, in both versions, the Westminster Confession, Second London Confession, is more compatible with, right? So it's a consensus document. They weren't trying to exclude the Baptists who didn't agree, but they explicitly didn't use that formula of one in substance, varied in administration. They purposely excluded that, and it had a version of covenant theology that expressed more of an understanding of progressive revelation, right? So I would delineate a couple things that make their version of covenant theology distinct, right? So one is they picked up a stream that was a minority stream in Paedo-Baptist covenant theology. So John Cameron articulated that the Mosaic Covenant's always been a bug for Paedo-Baptist covenant theology. Like, what do we do with it? Is it a covenant of works? Is it a covenant of grace? Is it a republication of the covenant of works? Is it just administration of the covenant of grace, but it feels more conditional? What do we do? So that's always been an issue that has been a divide within Paedo-Baptist covenant theology, how to explain the Mosaic Covenant. In the same way that the New Covenant, ironically, by analogy, has been an issue for dispensationalists, right? Like, how does it apply to the church, right? But for each side has their trouble covenants, you could say, but for them, it's that. Well, there was a minority stream in Paedo-Baptist covenant theology represented by someone like John Cameron, who said, the Mosaic Covenant is really not the covenant of works or the covenant of grace, which which is difficult to explain in this bicovenantal scheme of explaining redemptive history. It's this third kind of covenant, a subservient covenant. It's a covenant that is neither one, but points to the covenant of grace and is subservient to it. And so that got picked up and got translated by Bolton. Sam Ranahan details all this in his dissertation, right? Picked up by Bolton and found a home in the Congregationalists. So Jeremiah Burroughs and Owen himself, right? They use this language of the subservient covenant in talking about the Mosaic covenant and the New Covenant. And what's interesting about that is they're recognizing that the Old Covenant and the New Covenant are not one in substance. There's a difference. There's a substantial difference between them. What the Baptists did is they took that same logic in the 17th century Baptists and they extended it back towards the Abrahamic covenant. So it's not just the Mosaic covenant that's a subservient covenant. It's also the Abrahamic covenant that's a subservient covenant. And so so all versions of covenant theology recognize there's a kind of a duality, right? There's two aspects to the Abrahamic covenant. There's parts of it that are spiritual and there's parts that are physical. Well, for the Paedo-Baptists, that's easy, right? They just see both aspects continuing in the same covenant, and they just run it all through redemptive history. That's why there's the external administration and the internal substance of the one covenant of grace. That's how you can baptize unbelieving infants, right? Infants who aren't professing faith, and they're part of the covenant of grace externally because they're part of the external administration. So they're partaking of the physical benefits of the covenant of grace, but they're not necessarily part of the internal essence of the covenant of grace. And so they see that two functioning, the spiritual and physical aspects running in the same way through the whole covenant of grace because it's one in substance and just different administration. So the administration of the covenant of grace is updated from circumcision to sprinkling babies, so you can do boys and girls, right? But it's this functions the same in essence. The Baptists said, well, no, those two aspects, the spiritual and physical, actually find themselves get represented. Nehemiah, there's disagreement. Sam Ranahan would disagree with Nehemiah Cox here, but most of the Baptists in the 17th century actually said there's two covenants. They would talk about the covenant of grace and the covenant of circumcision, to use Paul's language in Acts 7. And so that finds fulfillment and expansion in the Mosaic covenant, and that it's that covenant of circumcision, the physical aspects of the Abrahamic covenant with the Mosaic covenant, that's replaced by the new covenant, right? And the spiritual aspects find fulfillment in the new covenant. Well, all right. So once you say that, so that's why they're going to see, that's why it's going to end up being Credo Baptist, right? Because now it's only those who have faith, the faith of Abraham, are members of Abraham's offspring, namely those who believe in Jesus Christ, who therefore get the sign. So once you see that, okay, well, I think what progressive covenantalism is arguing, although the terminology might be different, is really the exact same thing. Because I would say that any distinctly Credo Baptist version of covenant theology is going to have to say there's a substantial difference between the Old and New Covenant, and the Abrahamic covenant has two stages of fulfillment for the physical and the spiritual aspects of the New Covenant. They can't coexist in the same covenant and map right over to the New Covenant. So that is the same thing that both versions of Baptist covenantal theology are arguing today. And both groups are figuring out, there's Baptists who are making similar arguments. They weren't all universal. They said things a little differently. They didn't all nuance it in the same way. But Baptists have been making covenantal arguments that lead to a Credo Baptist ecclesiology since the middle of the 17th century.
That was like drinking from a fire hydrant. That was great, and I mean that in a positive way. But that was a lot to take in. And I want to step back, and I want to ask a couple of, and Brent, feel free to jump in on this question if you have a thought. Would it be right to say, and again, sometimes I have guests on just so I can correct myself, make sure I'm saying things the right way. And you guys are both very educated men, and I can ask you this. In progressive covenantalism, we don't tend to use the terms covenant of works, covenant of grace, those things. But if we were going to say covenant of grace, we would say it's the new covenant. And within 1689 Federalism, they're agreeing with us that the new covenant is the essence of, or is the covenant of grace. Is that correct
right.
to say?
Yeah. And that's a big difference. That's a big difference. And listen, if you look at the First London Baptist Confession of Faith, so Keith, you said you guys hold the First London, and
it says covenant of grace, and one of the articles actually uses the term covenant of grace.
Yeah. The language actually is the New Covenant of Grace. Right. Well, hey,
yes, you're correct. You're correct.
I have no disagreement with that. The New Covenant of Grace, right? That is revealed by further steps, is the language in Second London, from the Proto-Evangelion, right, from Genesis 3:15, that exists as a promise. The promise is Christ in the New Covenant, right? Because that's where forgiveness of sins is found, and that promise is ultimately fulfilled in Christ and the New Covenant. And so, if that's what you mean by covenant of grace, I don't have any substantial disagreement with you.
Yeah.
I'll just add, it's important in these conversations to ask what people mean by covenant of grace. Sometimes covenant of grace can just be a reference to like the overall plan of God. Sometimes
just more like the decree or providence. Or
decree, providence. But sometimes these things can get a little tricky, because while extra biblical terms are really helpful, for example, an extra biblical term like the Trinity is really helpful then to explain what the Bible teaches. What's a little tricky with covenant of grace, of course, is that, well, the biblical wording of covenants, the covenant is used. And so we have to be, when we're thinking, I guess, in terms of more, I'm just talking in theological language. When we're talking about, you're going to use the phrase covenant of grace, it's always important to step back and ask, can you unpack that? Can you explain that? Can you unpack that, just to be clear? Because there's all sorts of assumptions or presuppositions that come in with such language. I mean, like Richard saying, I don't have a problem necessarily with the terminology covenant of grace. I'd want to be careful to.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, what define that? What do you mean by it? So that's just one little caveat that I would put out there for people.
And really, I mean, look at the parallel Paul gives us in Romans 5. You're either in Adam or you're in Christ. Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm. And so that's the fundamental covenantal difference, right? You're either in covenant with Adam or you're in covenant with Christ. And if that's all what people mean by covenant of works, covenant of grace, then I don't have any theological disagreements with that. The question is that the best way to describe it? Well, it's fine. I think it can be helpful as an ordo salutist framework, right? As a framework for explaining the dogmatic categories of the law gospel distinction. But I don't find that framework of the covenant of works, covenant of grace as helpful to explain the nuances of the Historia Salutis. The difference is, for Paedo-Baptist Covenant Theology, those categories do double duty. They work both ways. But for Baptists, they don't work both ways. So that's why we have to push back. 69 Federalist wants to adopt that language, that terminology, but then redefine those categories. That's fine. That's one rhetorical, polemical strategy. Another one is to say, you know what, let's just set aside that terminology and let's look at the historical biblical covenants and see what we actually mean. To me, those are rhetorical differences, polemical differences, theological articulation strategies. They're not substantial differences. If you're going to be consistently Baptist, you're going to have to say something different about the covenant of grace, right? And something different about the new covenant between a Baptist and a Paedo-Baptist.
Richard, I remember when we were talking the night that we met, we had a long conversation. At least it was long for me. I've thought a lot about it since then. And one of the things we talked about was the idea of this idea of the covenant of works. Because I remember at that time, I think you were still working on. Maybe we went to lunch after. I think maybe that was the conversation. Yeah. And you mentioned that you were working on writing on the subject of the what we call what the progressive covenantalists would call the creation covenant.
Hi, my name's Justin Johnson.
And I'm Josiah Stowe.
And we are Dominion Wealth Strategists. We are created to put money in the hands of those that are sitting in the pews.
From budgeting to estate planning, savings accounts, retirement planning, life insurance, and a heck of a lot more here at Dominion.
That means that you are leaving an inheritance that passes multiple generations, because that is the legacy. It's part of our mission.
All of Christ for all of life.
And all of finance for Christendom.
So if you could for a moment, because as I understand, and I have an issue when I hear someone say covenant of works and they talk about Adam being able to earn his way to the tree of life and those things, I really have some difficulty with that language. And the word covenant obviously is not found in Genesis 1 and 2, but you argue that there is still a covenant there. It's just not the language of covenant. And you argue because, at least in the book, it's mentioned that Adam is our head, and we do believe in that he represents the head of the human race, and therefore when he acts, he's acting on our behalf. So there's a covenantal relationship there. So can you at least maybe help me understand what would be the difference in your view of the creation covenant and maybe the 1689 view of the covenant of works?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's probably a whole episode here. Okay.
I know.
I mean, I think maybe here's a simple way to say it. Brent says it like this too. So we're pivoting off each other. It's the same plus. Okay. Right. Like, I want to say everything they say, and I want to say a little more. Okay. At one level. But let me just make a couple comments, if you will. First of all, if someone's interested like yourself, I think, especially coming from more maybe of a New Covenant theology background, if you read Kingdom Through Covenant and Steve Wellum's discussion of active obedience, that's where he gets into this the most. I think that would be helpful. And what's interesting is the Reformed Baptist community has had issues around this because, again, for a couple of reasons. One, because they learned their covenant theology from John Murray, and John Murray was not confessional on the covenant of works. He didn't use that language of covenant works. He didn't like the language of covenant applying to a pre-fall arrangement. He just called it like Adamic administration, right? And so that's reflected in someone like, if you read Greg Nichols' book on covenant theology, which was, Greg Nichols came out of Al Martin's ministerial academy. He denies covenant works. And some have pointed out that the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith actually removes the language of the covenant of works in a couple spots that is in the Westminster Confession. So some have highlighted that, but I think Sam Ranahan has done a good job demonstrating that it's still there in substance and in name. And he found like 25 references to Baptists in the 17th century that use that language. So it's there. But okay, my problem with, okay, if here's what you're saying is, number one, God made Adam as the federal head of the human race, and he commanded him to perfectly obey that law, and he and then what? I'm jumping ahead for a second. And when he fell, he plunged with him all of creation into the fall, and that Christ has to come as a new Adam, right? The last Adam, to be our federal head, to succeed, perfectly obey where Adam failed, right? And since Adam fell, we no longer are able to perfectly obey. In Adam, Adam could have, he was lapsable even though he was perfect, right? So he could have fell, which he did. In the resurrected state, we won't be lapsable, right? We're not able to sin, right? So, and I think maybe the sticking point that you mentioned is whether or not there's this kind of implicit promise of eternal life. And I'd say a couple things about that. So I think that the taking as a whole, a bigger picture of the whole canon, the tree of life is significant. We see it in the prophets, right? In Ezekiel, we see it popping up in Revelation 2, the end of the Revelation 21, 22. And I think they're seeing, okay, look, in the eschatological life, that's represented by eating from the tree of life, right? And even in Genesis 3, they're barred from eating from the tree of life. Like God puts an angel there to keep them from that. So what does all that symbolize? Well, I think what we need to recognize is that Adam was created good, but he was not created glorified. The glorified state will be in the future, will be an exalted, resurrected state that's better than the state that Adam was created in, right? So there was some sort of, if you don't like the language of probation, there's a temporariness to it all, right? Like that the original creation was not meant to be the new heavens and new earth, the final creation, right? Like the plan of redemption was built into creation, right? Jesus Christ was the Lamb of God slain before the foundation of the world. So, and what we see God always doing, right? Look at the Mosaic covenant for the most explicit example of this, the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. And so there was a blessed life, a glorified life, an eating of the tree of life that Adam would have been given access to if he perfectly obeyed God's law, which he failed to do. So that's a roundabout way of describing, and maybe in the most kind of palatable way, what I think is about the covenant works. We could talk about all the biblical argumentation for why we want to call the creational arrangement a covenant, but I think what progressive covenantalism is interested in preserving, that we find missing in a lot of presentations of the creational arrangement, the creational covenant, the covenant of works, is even that language, right? So I understand there's been, in the history of Reform, in the Reformed tradition, there's different language used for that covenant, right? Some call it the covenant of nature to describe the original context. Some call it the covenant of life to talk about the promise. Some call it covenant of creation because of the setting. The covenant of works is probably most prominent, but that highlights that demand of perfect obedience, which is certainly an important part of what was happening in that Genesis arrangement, which is a theme that's highlighted throughout all the covenantal arrangements. God is still a holy God and still demands perfect obedience. The question is, how is that rendered to him, and who can render that to him? That's always the condition of acceptance before him, either on our own, which we can't do now in light of the fall, or on the basis of Christ meriting that for us. So it's that logic of active obedience, of Christ needing to merit for us eternal life, that I think is kind of like theologically brought into that creational arrangement. But what we want to say is, look, again, going back to those categories of Ordo and Historia Salutis, from an Ordo Salutis point of view, yes, like all that's true, but there's other things happening in that creational arrangement. There is all this language that is eschatologically pointed, right? Like the foundation of marriage is not just a building block of human society, but it's a picture of Christ's relationship to the church. Adam, the fact that he is dwelling in the garden, which could be accurately described in temple-like categories, right? The Edenic categories are repeated back when the temple's described. All that is trying to symbolize what it means to dwell with God in his covenantal presence. And then Adam as a priest, mediating God's law, and the fact that he's a son of God, right? The sonship and image and likeness is picked up and is brought into the covenantal arrangement. So Israel itself as a nation is a new Adam because it's a son of God in the same way that Adam was. Adam is called a son of God explicitly in Luke 4. And the Davidic king is called a son of God in the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. Ultimately, Jesus himself is that ultimate God and man, right? He's the new Adam and he's the son of God in an exalted sense. And so there's all these kind of eschatological, right? Like redemptive historical trajectories built in to the creational covenant that I think at times, and this is the complaint by Steve Wellum, are at least muted by a singular focus on the works demand of this creational arrangement, that they're focusing on this Ordo Salutis, that they miss out on the Historia Salutis, and how there's actually, yes, a big continuity. Genesis 3 is one of the major dividing lines of the whole Bible, right? Fall, post-fall, but yet there's a lot of continuity, right? I mean, look at the Noahic covenant, and these creational structures are picked up, right? The dominion mandate is picked up again. And so it's trying to reestablish what it means to still represent God and have dominion, but now in a fallen world, they have to do it in a new way. And so I feel like even though you can find bits and pieces of that in different authors of covenant theology, that's at the best exponents of it, it at least eclipsed in most presentations of the covenant works. And this is what progressive covenantalism was trying to highlight in focusing on the redemptive historical progression of the biblical covenants themselves and how they relate to each other.
Again, it's great. No, I mean, I could do this all day. I appreciate it. Brent, I don't know if you agree with Brent. Anything you want to add, Brent? Or I'm going to move to another question, but I don't want to leave you out, brother. I know this is a heavy topic.
This is all Richard, this has been your baby in a sense. You've been really focusing on it, and yeah, I think your description is right on. That's a great way of describing it. Some people may need to back it up and rehear what you all just said. There's a lot there, but that's all right.
So I know we're getting to the end of our second hour together, and oh, my camera moved again, but that's okay. We're getting to the end of our second hour. We're having a great time. At least I am enjoying the conversation. But I have I want to go in a little different direction for this last portion. We talked about the tripartite distinction of the law. We talked about going back to the covenant of creation, and that being a big at least from a guy who's coming, from a new covenant theology perspective into the progressive covenantalism, that was like a huge deal, because in new covenant theology, there's a denial of the covenant of works. That's specifically, at least again, there's not a ubiquitous, but it's, for the most part, yeah. And so the other thing that comes up a lot, and this may be one of those times where, again, Richard, you're going to say, well, that'd be another podcast, and it probably would, but we're going to condense down this to this final portion. And I hope you both have some thoughts on this. And that is the application of, or rather, how we understand the law in the new covenant. Because when we talk about things like three uses of the law, the reformers talked about the pedagogical use of the law, the civil use of the law, and then the normative use of the law. And we understand these are just practical ways of understanding what it means to live the Christian life, right? What it means to become a Christian. We recognize our sins condemn us, and Christ is the only one who can save us. That's how the law, becomes a schoolmaster leading us to Christ, right? These are languages that we hear in the scripture, and we understand what that means. But in the New Testament, we see repetition of certain laws from the Old Testament. We see, the mentioning of many of the commandments. Obviously, murder and adultery are brought up in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus connects murder to hatred and adultery with lust. And then later, the Apostle Paul will even connect other things, like, the idea of having two or three witnesses. This is an Old Testament principle that he's bringing into the New Testament, or even more specific things like the ox not treading out the grain, being able to eat while he's treading out the grain, right? And that being the reason why we actually pay our ministers, right? This is a principle taken from the Old Testament. So I guess the way I want to word this question and have you both speak on it is within progressive covenantalism, which is both of you are representatives of, what is that continuity of the old covenant, new covenant? I mean, because within Baptist circles, we have guys who call themselves theonomists, right? Guys who are saying we have to maintain not only the moral, but also the civil law. We have guys who would say, no, we don't do the civil, but we still have the moral law. And that's where the Sabbath issue comes in. But I guess like you read in the new covenant, you read terms like the law of Christ, the law of liberty, the law of love. We hear Jesus say, a new commandment I've given to you, to love one another as I have loved you. This is a new commandment. This is something, that's distinct. So how do we explain the differences? And again, I said, I know it could be a whole nother podcast, but in a simplified way, how do we address these issues of the ongoing nature? Do we call it moral law? I tend to use the phrase transcendental law versus covenantal law, but that sometimes can be confusing for people. And what I mean by that, I say there's a law that transcends all of the covenants. This law that has always existed. It was wrong when Abel was murdered by Cain, even though there was no written law that said it. It was still wrong, and it was still wrong to murder today. That law is transcendent. It transcends all the covenants. But within the Mosaic covenant, there is law. So talk to me. Tell me what you think. What's your thoughts?
Maybe just in reference to just a couple sources for people to dig a little deeper than we're going to have time to now. Jason Hiroshi has a great newer book, Delighting in the Old Testament. Great. He talks all about this. So in a lot of detail, really helpful. Another book by not someone who explicitly affirms progressive covenantalism, but I think his view of the law would be very compatible in many ways. Brian Rosner's book in the New Studies in Biblical Theology, Paul and the Law. Great. And, he comes up with like three different categories to explain different uses of the law, right? Some is I won't get into that, but maybe just for the sake of time, I'll just say that some versions of New Covenant theology have gotten themselves in trouble is because in their rejection of the tripart division of the law and their emphasizing of the law of Christ, they have overemphasized the discontinuity between the Mosaic law and the New Covenant law, right? So yes, there's covenantal differences, absolutely. What we're arguing is that tripartite division, which is represented in the Westminster Confession of Faith tradition of dividing the law in those three parts, and then that's how they decide what carries over, right? Well, the reality is, and I'm not sure all 1689 guys that at least profess 1689 fully appreciate this, but their version of Baptist covenant theology has to do something a little different than that Westminster tradition, because they're saying the whole old covenant as a covenant is replaced by the new covenant. Well, okay, now we're saying something kind of similar. Okay.
Yeah, so, that's what we said. I mean, that's when I say we, I'm putting myself in that category. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Sam Ranham even says in his book, the one published by Founders Press, The Mystery of Christ, that there's a more fundamental distinction in the law, but below that tripart division. He uses the categories of, natural law and positive law, or moral,
which is,
law.
I think, similar to what I'm saying with the transcendent versus covenantal. I think I would probably be safer to maybe use his language, because I understand that. Yeah.
Well, and really, if you go back and read some of the better exponents, I'll say the better exponents of New Covenant theology, someone like a Gary Long, in his book, he talks about, he uses the categories of absolute and covenantal law. Well, that's basically the same thing. Okay.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
And Sam Ranahan actually, in his book, The Mystery of Christ, says what distinguishes positive law differently. He basically says moral law equates to natural law, and civil and ceremonial fall underneath the positive categories. What makes them positive is that they're added to natural law, right? And he says covenants are positive arrangements. They're not natural arrangements. So they rise and fall with different covenants. Oh, okay. Well, there's a natural morality that reflects the character of God that transcends all of redemptive history. That's transcovenantal. And then there's other laws that rise and fall with different covenants. Well, that's the same thing we're saying. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. That's the exact same thing we're saying. So now we have the same hermeneutical framework. Now we're just getting into deciding, okay, well, what is natural? What's positive? Okay. Well, so now we're going to come full circle, because you started with the Sabbath. So we're coming back to the Sabbath. Okay. So now we're going to open up Exodus 20, right? Deuteronomy 5, Exodus 20, and we're going to look at the fourth commandment here. And I'm going to say, okay, so when he says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your maid, female servant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, first of all, there's nothing in here about worshiping. It's only about resting. Okay, right? Just as a note. I mean, nothing about the Sabbath is about worship. It's only about rest. That's I understand why they try to make that argument. It's just not here. Okay. Secondly, everyone, Presbyterian, 1689 guys, they're going to look at it and say, well, some parts of this are positive law because the day switches, right? All right. I mean, so it's not the seventh day. It becomes the first day. So the mere fact that it can change with a different covenant means it's positive, not natural. It's covenantal, not absolute. Okay. Well, but you just argued with me, right? I'm assuming, right? Well, the Decalogue's different. The Decalogue represents the moral law of God. Well, yes and no. I mean, if you mean love God, love neighbor, which is what Jesus summarized in Matthew 22, absolutely. It represents that, right? And the specifics are outflowing of that. But you're saying that, well, at least parts of the fourth commandment are positive. Well, how did you decide that? Well, because it's not what's represented in creation. When I go back to, it's not incidental that it's the last day. I mean, that's kind of built into creation that it's the seventh day. It's not like, well, it's just pick a day. The day can switch. to me, that like the argument that because then what they got to say is, well, the reason the fourth commandment, even though the day switches, it still abides, and that it's moral law, not positive law, is because it's a creation ordinance. So therefore it's trans-covenantal. But it's not incidental what day it is. And then the question is, well, okay, what actually is happening in creation? And if what does the rest mean for God on that last day, on the last day of creation? And so part of what we need to recognize is that there is a typological difference between what's practiced in the old covenant and what's practiced in the new covenant, and we see that clearly. And our Baptist friends that are 69ers agree with us with reference to baptism, but they are inconsistent, I think, in applying the same typology that they believe in with baptism and applying it to the issue of the Sabbath. So yeah. I think the best way to have a conversation is, hey, like, let's talk about your understanding of typology between the old covenant and the new covenant with reference to circumcision and baptism, between the old covenant and new covenant, and let's see how that also applies to the issue of the Sabbath, and see if you're applying the same version of typology. As James White, is a good friend of yours, I know, says, the mark of a failed argument is inconsistency, right?
Yeah.
So if you're inconsistent in your application of typology, then maybe there's another problem here.
Absolutely. Now, Brent, you mentioned earlier that your actual work right now is on the subject of the Sabbath, or you're writing on that particular subject. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not particularly. We're hoping to do a journal article.
Oh, okay.
Southern Baptist Journal of Theology, which would have a variety of contributors. We're hoping to do that. I'll just add to, what Richard just gave is, is so helpful. There's been so much written on the law. How do we know what comes over? Tom Schreiner has his 40 questions on the law that's helpful. And then another way is we're thinking, of course, the Mosaic Law Covenant is Scripture, and so it's authority. It's an exercise then of thinking, how does the law come over through Christ, and in what aspects are there? Do they go back to creation structures? And so within some, I think in New Covenant theology, we'll say, well, what is applies to us is whether or not the New Testament repeats or reaffirms what's written in the Mosaic Law. And Steve Wellum, in a chapter on the doing of ethics in a volume that I co-edited with him, on the volume I co-edited with Steve Wellum, Progressive Covenantalism, Charting a Course Between Dispensational and Covenant Theology, he really puts his finger on this. I think it's Doug Moo who's arguing something like this, that, well, whatever is repeated in the New Testament is then applies to Christians. But then Steve Wellum points out, well, wait, the bestiality is not repeated in the New Testament. But of course, we know that would not be at all acceptable. And how would you ground that? Well, yeah, it's condemned in the Mosaic Law Covenant, but also going back to creation structures and what marriage is, and the covenantal sexual relationship between a husband and a wife is the norm. And so a good part of it then is also thinking through not just the Mosaic Law Covenant and how it comes over into the New Covenant, but now also big picture. It's again going also all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2. And thinking about, in terms of our ethics and what we decide is right, and thinking about going back to creation order, creation structures. I mean, already with, yes, murder is condemned in the Ten Commandments, but already that murder is wrong with Cain and Abel. That's before the Mosaic Law Covenant. That murder is wrong. And so I'm just adding that all the discussion, what's transcendental or what's absolute versus covenantal law or positive law versus, everything that's been talked about absolutely. But I'm just also just in terms of thinking through, in terms of how we do ethics, what we determine right and wrong. We go back to creation order, creation structures, and now we're doing a little bit more of a whole Bible a theology, and not just thinking through, okay, how does the New Testament cite the Ten Commandments, or how does the New Testament, how do they cite Mosaic Law Covenant? That's important, of course. I think Joshua Griever has written an excellent article in the Southern Baptist Journal of Theology that the way Paul cites the Mosaic Law Covenant, it shows that it's that the tripart distinction, moral, civil, ceremonial, is a bit artificial. So I'd commend that article by Joshua Griever, and there's just it's a huge topic. It's really a podcast in itself.
Steve Williams got a helpful little essay on TGC, on the law of God, in their theological essays. I maybe just a helpful framework, 4 C's, right? Character, creation, conscience, covenant. So the standard for all law is the character of God, right? Like that's what's determining right or wrong, right? The character of God, that is reflected. The character of God is reflected in creation norms and creation structures, and that same character built into creation is imprinted on the human conscience. So that's why I think we have an innate sense of knowing right and wrong. I think that's what Romans 2 is talking about. But that gets worked out along different covenantal arrangements. So how we understand what is applicable at different times is those different covenants.
I just finished teaching an 8-week course on biblical law and ethics, and I wish I had those 4 C's. That would have been a great part of giving to the class. So hopefully the people who took the class will actually watch this all the way to the end, so they can hear that. That was a great summary there, Richard. I appreciate that. One last question, and then we're gonna wrap up, because we've been going now for almost 3 hours, guys. It's been a while. So thank your families for giving you to me for this time, and to our audience. But this is a question. I think I know the answer, but I'd really like to hear both of you. And it's a yes or no question, but it may not be that easy. And it's the question of theonomy. The question is, can a progressive covenantalist also be a theonomist? It seems to me like that would be a difficult thing, but theonomy is a big question right now. So can a progressive covenantalist be a theonomist? Does that even make sense?
What do you mean by theonomy, right?
Okay.
Do I believe in God's law? Yes. Do I believe God's
Yes.
law is applicable to me? Yes. But it applies to me in those 4 C's, right? If what you mean is if what somebody just means, like, okay, so sometimes people want to have like a soft version of theonomy, like, well, I'm a general equity theonomist, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, again, to me, that's a mixing of categories, because how you determine what is generally equitable is appealing back to God's character, reflected in creation norms, imprinted the human conscience, reflected along this covenantal framework of the Bible. So to me, it's not adding anything helpful to describe what is generally equitable. It doesn't provide me the hermeneutical framework for explaining how to do that. Is there any lessons to be learned from the Old Covenant about civil structure? Yes. Is the church trying to establish a theocracy like Israel? No. Right. So ultimately, I don't think so, because it's a mixing of categories, and I think it's an insufficient understanding of biblical law and of how the Old Covenant civil laws apply in our New Covenant context.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I'll just add, for progressive covenantalism, you can be a historic premill, amillennialist, even I think post-millennialist, and that all works. But I will add, if you're a theonomist in the sense that the state should be applying not just the second table of the law, but the first table of the law, then that would take you, I think, out of progressive covenantalism. If you mean a theonomist like Greg Bahnsen, you have moral, civil, ceremonial, and only the ceremonial is gone and the moral and civil, of course, still apply, then yeah, I don't think that's compatible with progressive covenantalism either. So just a couple more thoughts to add to what Richard was discussing. But it's kind of, as he was saying, it's kind of like the terminology covenant of grace. You have to ask, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? And Christ Overall, I'll just point out, Christ Overall did a bunch of interviews and discussions on the church and state, natural law, these types of things. So that's christoverall.com. Mm-hmm. And look for those, from Andrew Walker to, I think they even interviewed Tom Askell, to Albert Mohler. There's a whole host. You could check Jonathan Lehman. You can check all those things out. So that's my quick 2 cents.
Great. And I always have to quote R. Scott Clark. He was on my show last year, and I asked him this question, and he said, "You know what? I always salute General Equity when he marches by." So I love that. Love that joke. All right, gentlemen, thank you both so much again for all of the time that we have had. I really super appreciate all that you've given. So if we could just come to a close again, you guys, if you didn't see the first episode, go back and watch it. Get the book that these gentlemen have edited and produced for us. It's a wonderful addition to the conversation about dispensationalism and covenantalism, and not only that, but also progressive covenantalism and progressive dispensationalism. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much, Keith, for having us.
Yes,
yeah,
sir.
Thank you so much. God bless.
God bless you. And again, I want to thank you guys for watching the show. I want to remind you the best way you can help support the show is hitting that subscribe button down at the bottom. And if you haven't already, hit the thumbs up button for this episode if you enjoyed it. And if you didn't, hit the thumbs down button twice. All right, guys, thank you for listening to Your Calvinist podcast. My name is Keith Foskey, and I've been Your Calvinist. May God bless you.
Sometimes I feel the weight of the world fall down on me, and I need a friendly voice with some good theology. So I mix a manly drink, then I hit the YouTube link, and I feel my troubles all melt away. Oh, it's Your Calvinist podcast with Keith Foskey. Beards and bow ties, laughs till sunrise. It's Your Calvinist podcast with Keith Foskey. He's not like most Calvinists, he's nice.
Your Calvinist podcast with Keith Foskey, striving for superior theology and denominational unity, one joke at a time.